This is not how empires announced their dissolution. There were no emergency briefings, no primetime addresses, no dramatic summits where leaders faced cameras and explained what had been lost. On March 12, 2025, Mark Carney signed a directive that most people interpreted as routine energy policy, a technical adjustment to export licensing frameworks, the kind of administrative decision that generates a brief mention in trade publications before disappearing into the noise of daily governance. The White House responded with the usual rhetoric, tough talk about renegotiation, confident assurances that American interests would be protected. The language of a power that still believes it dictates terms. 3 weeks later, refineries in the American Midwest began receiving notifications, not cancellations, not threats, simply revised delivery schedules for Canadian crude. Shipments that had flowed south for decades were being redirected. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just enough to change the calculations that American energy infrastructure depends on. This is where most observers made their first critical error. They treated this as a negotiating position, a pressure tactic designed to extract concessions before returning to normal operations. They assumed that economic interdependence would force both sides back to the table, back to the comfortable arrangements that had defined the relationship for generations. They were measuring the present using frameworks that had already stopped functioning. What Carney understood, what American strategists failed to recognize until it was too late, is that leverage does not announce itself. It simply appears in the structure of alternatives that one side possesses and the other does not. Canada had spent 18 months building those alternatives, not as a threat, not as a weapon, as insurance against exactly the kind of dependency that Trump's tariff strategy had exposed. The Churchill port expansion, the eastward pipeline infrastructure, the processing agreements with European and Asian buyers. These were not contingency plans. They were completed facts. Physical infrastructure that transformed theoretical alternatives into executable options. American refineries designed specifically for Canadian heavy crude discovered something uncomfortable. They could not simply switch to lighter domestic shale oil without massive retooling. Equipment designed for one type of crude does not magically adapt to another. The chemistry is different. The processing requirements are different. The capital costs to modify existing facilities run into tens of billions of dollars. This created a dependency structure that had been invisible as long as Canadian supply remained reliable and predictable. The moment that reliability became conditional, the dependency became a vulnerability. Trump's energy advisors had calculated that Canada would never restrict supply because Canadian producers needed American markets. This was accurate in 2023. It stopped being accurate in early 2025 when Canadian export infrastructure reached sufficient capacity to serve alternative customers at comparable prices. The mathematics shifted without drama. Canadian producers could now choose between American refineries and international buyers. American refineries could not choose between Canadian heavy crude and domestic alternatives without reconstruction timelines measured in years. This is what leverage looks like when it operates through infrastructure rather than threats. The initial supply adjustments were modest. A 5% reduction in export volumes to the United States, officially attributed to maintenance schedules and domestic demand increases. Nothing that could be challenged as a violation of existing trade agreements. Nothing that justified emergency responses or diplomatic escalation. But 5% was sufficient to change refinery economics in Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois. Input costs rose, operating margins compressed. The refineries that had been designed around reliable Canadian supply discovered that reliability was no longer a given. It was a privilege that required something they could no longer automatically provide: acceptance of Canadian terms. The technical specifications of this dependency deserve examination because they reveal why the shift was so difficult to counter. American Gulf Coast and Midwest refineries had invested decades and billions in coking units, hydrocrackers, and desulfurization equipment, specifically calibrated for the heavy, sour characteristics of Canadian oil sands crude. These are not general-purpose facilities that can process any hydrocarbon input. They are precision industrial systems optimized for specific molecular compositions. The bitumen extracted from Alberta's oil sands contains higher concentrations of sulfur, heavy metals, and complex hydrocarbon chains than the light, tight oil produced from American shale formations. Processing it requires more aggressive chemical treatment, higher temperatures, and longer residence times in cracking towers. The engineering is sophisticated and expensive. Retrofitting a refinery designed for heavy Canadian crude to process light American shale would require replacing or substantially modifying the coking units, reconfiguring the entire downstream processing chain, and accepting lower yields of valuable products like diesel and jet fuel. The timeline for such modifications ranges from 3 to 7 years. The cost ranges from $8 to $24 billion per facility, depending on capacity and complexity. No refinery operator could justify this investment when Canadian crude remained available at any price point that kept operations profitable. The modifications only made economic sense if Canadian supply became permanently unavailable. As long as Canadian oil could be purchased, even at premium prices, buying it remained cheaper than rebuilding refineries. This created what systems theorists call a lock-in effect. American refineries were structurally committed to Canadian crude, regardless of price fluctuations or political tensions. Their only alternative was temporary shutdown while they rebuilt for different inputs. Carney's energy directive exploited this lock-in with precision. It did not prohibit exports to the United States. It simply required export licenses that prioritized contracts offering competitive international pricing and long-term commitments. American refineries that wanted guaranteed supply could have it, at market prices, under terms that eliminated the historical discount they had enjoyed. The second phase unfolded in energy futures markets. Traders who had spent careers assuming stable Canadian supply began pricing in uncertainty. Western Canadian Select, the benchmark for Canadian heavy crude, had historically traded at a significant discount to international benchmarks because Canadian producers had limited market access and were forced to accept American refinery prices. That discount began to narrow, not because of speculation, because actual transaction prices reflected genuine competition between American buyers and international alternatives. Canadian producers were receiving offers from European and Asian refiners that matched or exceeded American prices. The discount that American refineries had enjoyed for decades was not a reflection of oil quality or extraction costs. It was a reflection of Canadian market captivity. Once that captivity ended, so did the discount. American refineries faced a choice: pay international prices for Canadian crude or undertake multi-billion-dollar facility modifications to process different oil types. The choice was not difficult. They paid. This represented a wealth transfer of approximately $47 per barrel on 4.3 million barrels daily, roughly $200 million per day flowing from American refineries to Canadian producers, $7 billion monthly, $84 billion annually. This was not theft. This was not extortion. This was the market price of a commodity that buyers desperately needed and could no longer source elsewhere at lower cost. The wealth transfer manifested in quarterly earnings reports throughout the American refining sector. Marathon Petroleum, Valero Energy, Phillips 66, all reported margin compression directly attributable to increased feedstock costs. Their explanations to shareholders were carefully worded. They spoke of changing market dynamics and global price convergence. They did not use the word leverage. They did not acknowledge that a foreign government had systematically restructured the market to extract maximum value from American dependency. But financial analysts understood. Research reports from Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and J.P. Morgan began modeling the American refining sector under the assumption that cheap Canadian crude was a historical anomaly rather than a permanent condition. Equity valuations adjusted accordingly. Billions in market capitalization evaporated as investors recalculated future profitability. The third phase involved something more subtle. Canadian energy companies began requiring American buyers to commit to longer-term contracts at prices indexed to international benchmarks rather than domestic American prices. These contracts included provisions that locked American refineries into Canadian supply relationships for 10, 15, 20 years. American refineries signed. They signed because the alternative was operational shutdown while they rebuilt facilities for different crude types. They signed because their shareholders demanded continued operations and dividend payments. They signed because they had no practical alternative. Each signature represented a surrender of optionality, a recognition that the relationship had fundamentally changed, that Canada now held the leverage that American policymakers had assumed would always remain with the larger economy. The contract terms themselves contained subtle but significant shifts in power dynamics. Force majeure clauses that had traditionally protected buyers now included provisions protecting Canadian suppliers. Pricing formulas that had referenced American benchmarks now referenced Brent and other international standards. Dispute resolution mechanisms that had defaulted to American jurisdiction now specified neutral arbitration in Geneva or Singapore. These were not dramatic changes. No individual clause represented a revolutionary shift, but cumulatively, they rewrote the legal architecture of North American energy trade. They transformed relationships that had been structured around American advantage into relationships that treated both parties as equals operating in a genuinely international market. The political response in Washington revealed how completely the strategic situation had been misunderstood. Congressional hearings focused on Canadian aggression, on betrayal by a trusted ally, on the need to develop American energy independence through accelerated domestic production. These hearings generated television footage and political theater. They did not change the physical reality that American refineries were designed for Canadian crude and could not be redesigned quickly enough to matter. Senator Jim Risch of Idaho demanded explanations for why the State Department had not anticipated Canadian resource leverage. The answers he received were bureaucratic and evasive. No one wanted to acknowledge that decades of American policy had been built on the assumption that Canada would never assert independent interests when those interests conflicted with American preferences. Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, facing constituent anger over gasoline prices, introduced legislation to mandate refinery modifications using federal subsidies. The Congressional Budget Office estimated the cost at $270 billion over 10 years. The legislation died in committee when neither party could justify that expenditure to voters already concerned about deficit spending. Trump's trade negotiators approached their Canadian counterparts with proposals, offers to revisit tariff structures, suggestions for mutual concessions that would restore previous arrangements. The language of equals engaged in good faith bargaining. Carney's team listened politely, then explained that Canadian energy policy was no longer structured around American market access, that export decisions would be made based on returns to Canadian producers and Canadian strategic interests, that the United States was welcome to participate in Canadian energy markets on the same terms as other international buyers. This was diplomatic language for a simple reality. The subordinate relationship had ended. Canada would sell energy to the United States at market prices, under terms that served Canadian interests. American preferences were now inputs to Canadian decision-making rather than constraints on Canadian options. The response from American border states revealed the domestic political consequences. Governors in Michigan and Ohio faced constituents paying 41 cents more per gallon for gasoline, directly attributable to increased Canadian crude costs. These were not abstract geopolitical calculations. These were weekly expenses that families noticed immediately. Republican governors who had supported Trump's tough trade stance found themselves defending gasoline price increases to voters who did not care about strategic competition with Canada. They cared about fuel costs. They cared about heating bills. They cared about the direct economic impact of policies that had backfired. Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan released internal analyses showing that the state's economy was losing approximately $3.2 billion annually due to elevated energy costs. Manufacturing facilities that had operated on thin margins were relocating to Canadian provinces, where energy costs remained lower. The automotive suppliers that formed the backbone of Michigan's industrial economy were quietly exploring Windsor and Oakville as alternative production sites. This created a feedback loop that amplified the initial energy shock. Higher American energy costs reduced American industrial competitiveness. Reduced competitiveness encouraged manufacturing migration to Canada. Migration reduced American demand for energy while increasing Canadian leverage over remaining American facilities. The political pressure forced a strategic reassessment, not a public reversal, not a dramatic policy shift announced from the White House. Just a quiet recognition within the administration that the Canadian energy relationship could not be managed through pressure and ultimatums. By summer 2025, American negotiating positions had shifted. Requests replaced demands. Proposals emphasized mutual benefit rather than American priorities. The language of partnership returned, not because relationships had warmed, but because the alternative was continued economic damage in politically critical states. Canada's response was calibrated perfectly, not triumphalist, not antagonistic, simply professional. Canadian officials engaged constructively on issues where cooperation served mutual interests. They declined politely on matters where American requests conflicted with Canadian strategic objectives. This was the behavior of a country that no longer needed to justify its decisions to its southern neighbor. A country that had alternatives and was willing to use them. The broader implications extended far beyond energy markets. The successful exercise of Canadian leverage in one domain created precedents for others. If Canada could restructure energy relationships to serve Canadian interests, what prevented similar approaches to critical minerals, water resources, or agricultural exports? American strategic planners began wargaming scenarios where Canada systematically leveraged resource advantages across multiple sectors. These scenarios revealed uncomfortable conclusions. The United States had become dependent on Canadian resources in ways that were difficult to address through either market mechanisms or political pressure. The dependencies had been built over generations. They were embedded in infrastructure, supply chains, and economic relationships that could not be quickly reconfigured. They represented structural vulnerabilities that only became visible when the reliable partner decided to pursue independent interests. The infrastructure dependencies were particularly revealing. Pipelines that had been constructed in the 1970s and 1980s ran north to south, not east to west. Railway networks that moved Canadian crude to American refineries had no equivalent capacity moving to Canadian ports. The entire physical geography of North American energy had been designed around the assumption that Canadian resources flowed to American markets. Reversing this geography required more than policy decisions. It required steel, concrete, and time. It required ports that could handle supertankers. It required rail lines capable of moving unit trains of crude oil across the Canadian Shield. It required storage facilities, processing plants, and loading terminals that had never been necessary when the customer was always south of the border. Canada had built this infrastructure while American attention was focused elsewhere. While Washington debated Twitter controversies and cable news narratives, Canadian crews were laying pipe across permafrost, dredging harbors in Hudson Bay, and constructing the physical foundations of strategic autonomy. This is what it looks like when a subordinate relationship ends. Not with declarations of independence, not with military conflict, just with the quiet exercise of leverage that had always existed but had never been deployed. The energy sector transformation served as a template. Canadian critical mineral policies began following similar patterns: export licensing requirements, domestic processing mandates, contract terms that favored Canadian interests over buyer convenience. American manufacturers dependent on Canadian lithium, nickel, and rare earth elements discovered that reliability was conditional, that access required acceptance of Canadian terms, that the era of automatically prioritizing American customers had ended. Each sector where this pattern repeated reinforced the broader message. Canada was no longer managing its resource relationships to maximize American convenience. It was managing them to maximize Canadian advantage. The psychological impact in Washington was significant. For generations, American officials had approached Canada with the assumption that Canadian cooperation could be assumed rather than earned. That geographic proximity and economic integration created dependencies that ran primarily in one direction. The discovery that dependencies were mutual and that Canada could leverage them as effectively as the United States required a complete recalibration of strategic assumptions. This recalibration happened slowly. Bureaucracies do not easily abandon frameworks that have guided policy for decades, but the evidence became overwhelming. Canadian resource leverage was real. It was being exercised systematically, and it was changing the fundamental dynamics of the bilateral relationship. Internal assessments at the Pentagon revealed particularly uncomfortable conclusions. American military readiness depended on Canadian resources in ways that had never been systematically analyzed. The aluminum in fighter aircraft, the nickel in armor plating, the rare earth elements in precision guidance systems, the uranium in naval reactors, all of it sourced primarily or exclusively from Canadian territory. The Department of Defense had always assumed these resources would remain available because Canada was an ally. The possibility that Canada might leverage resource access to influence American policy decisions had never been seriously considered. It was being considered now. By late 2025, internal strategy documents at the State Department and Commerce Department began using different language to describe Canada, not as a junior partner or reliable ally whose interests automatically aligned with American priorities, but as an independent actor with distinct interests and significant leverage to pursue them. This shift in language reflected a shift in reality. The relationship was being renegotiated, not through formal agreements or diplomatic summits, through the accumulated weight of individual decisions where Canada prioritized its own interests and possessed the leverage to make those priorities stick. The long-term trajectory became clear to observers who understood structural power rather than declaratory policy. Canada had discovered that resource control, combined with alternative markets and political will, could reshape relationships that had seemed permanent. The energy future that American planners had assumed, abundant Canadian supply available on favorable terms supporting American economic growth, had been cancelled, not through hostile action, through Canadian pursuit of Canadian interests using leverage that had always existed but had never been fully deployed. Trump's shock was genuine. He had approached Canada with the assumptions that had guided American policy for generations, that economic size determined negotiating outcomes, that neighbors had no choice but to accept terms dictated by larger powers. He discovered that geography creates mutual dependencies, that alternatives change leverage calculations, that patience and infrastructure investment can shift power balances that seem fixed. History does not announce these transitions with clarity. There will be no date that historians mark as the end of American energy dominance and the beginning of Canadian resource leverage. The change is too gradual, too distributed across multiple decisions and policy adjustments, but the direction is unmistakable. A relationship that was structured around Canadian subordination has been restructured around mutual dependence between increasingly equal powers. The country that controls resources the other desperately needs is no longer the one paying the price of dependency. This is what it looks like when leverage quietly changes hands.